I'm an Iranian Canadian who, as of November 21st of 2018, has spent exactly half of our life in both countries. So I'm no stranger to being culturally misunderstood or confused about my own identity. My ideas not often clash with my parents', but I sometimes find myself confused about who I am and what culture do I belong to. When I travel back to Iran, I'm sometimes misunderstood and strange to many of their practices there. And oftentimes here, I'm viewed as a super Iranian girl. The reality is that I'm neither. I've taken elements from both cultures and from different experiences throughout my life to form my identity and become who I am today. And who I am today is a hybrid of both. Centuries ago, identities were formed based on cultures, traditions, religious practices, and tales that were all specific to geographical locations. But the communities of today are much less homogeneous. In today's world, immigration is more and more common, and traveling is much more feasible. Because of globalization, people now have access to identity-forming elements that they didn't have access to maybe even decades ago. In other words, one's identity is not necessarily derived from where they're from or where they reside, but it's from what they've chosen to be influenced by. And as a result of such rapid changes, we have people who've lived in multiple places and are influenced by multiple factors. This is not just my personal journey, but it's a story that is relatable by many people, many of you in this room, maybe. I was looking for some data to show the number of hybrids out there for my presentation today, but to be very honest with you, I had difficulty even researching and finding anything. I didn't even know what to type in that search box. Was I looking for the number of immigrants, the number of hybrids, but who really counts as a cultural hybrid? That was a very difficult task for me. All I came across was a number representing the number of immigrants. But immigrants alone don't account for all third culture individuals. And nowhere among those data could I find individuals who have lived in one location and have found external influences to define their culture and identity. I became a hybrid because of immigration, but there are people out there from interracial marriages, people who move around for work and live abroad temporarily, people in minority groups that have the same experience just through vastly different means. Adding to that idea, internet and social media now provide us with insight into how people live all across the globe, places that we couldn't have imagined knowing anything about maybe decades ago. My father, my own father, was always drawn to the culture of the West, and I'm always drawn to the culture of the East. He brought me here to raise me with Western values, and I always want to go back to preserve and hold on to what it was that I'd learned. For the longest time, he viewed me as backward and didn't understand my urge to go back. And I labeled him as westernized and detached from any culture. I failed to see him as belonging to a culture not of his own, as if he couldn't belong to anything non-Eastern. Reality was that he was raised in the heart of Tehran, listening to the Beatles and reading English books. And I was raised here, ironically, reading Iranian novels and playing traditional Iranian music. His best memories of his childhood were of his travels across the US and Europe, and my best memories are of going back to Iran to my grandma's house. I myself am guilty of having stereotyped him. In fact, this is so common that the New Yorker recently published an article about the Facebook group of Subtle Asian Traits, which is a platform to express cross-cultural experiences of Asian second-generation immigrants. These are kids who have a completely different cultural experiences at home. They face a different set of values, a different set of expectations, and a different set of customs at home than they do at school or at work. People like my dad or people who are on these websites could have lived their entire life in one location, but have found external influences or even influences at home that are independent of what their external world offers. And they find other cultures more relatable than what their home offers to them. Another interesting term used to refer to kids who move before or during their adolescent years is Generation 1.5, accounting for them having brought characteristics from home while assimilating to their new cultures at their new place that they've immigrated to. So the point that I'm trying to make today is that multiculturalism, in the sense of accepting others, is not sufficient for the world of today. We must remove the lens through which we categorize people and label them based on our understanding of where they come from, based on our understanding of who they are and how they look. After saying what a nice weather today, or in the case of Vancouver, probably making a comment about the rain, the second most common way to start a small talk with a stranger is to ask where they're from. Most people can get through that question in a very quick elevator ride. But for some of us, even a transatlantic flight just wouldn't quite cut it. On the other hand, we have people whose answers are quick and short, and they can have that conversation in an elevator ride, but it just doesn't satisfy the person asking. If you don't look like your answer, that question is then going to be followed up by another one asking, okay, but where are you really from? And in the case of encountering people who are a little bit more considerate, the follow-up question would ask where your parents are from. If you don't look like your answer, it's automatically assumed that you're not being forthcoming. And true or not, you're affiliated with a culture that you physically resemble. Similar to everything else that has drastically evolved in the recent years, multiculturalism must also evolve to transcend assumptions and stereotyping. Our identity is very easily labeled and judged based on our appearances, and despite our best attempts to ignore stereotyping, we still form first impressions and judgment based on our understanding of people's backgrounds. Stereotypes are formed based on assumptions of cultures. Assumptions that cultures are one thing, that there are a list of qualities, a list of habits, and a list of values that everyone in that culture should embody. But even within the most homogeneous societies, not everyone abides by the same sort of rules and practices exactly the same culture. In fact, such a list that we've so arbitrarily created is non-existent, in my opinion. And no, I'm not saying there's no unanimity among cultures, because oftentimes that unanimity is exactly what we're after. But my point here today is that there's diversity even among the most homogeneous societies out there. Even the most uniform cultures have individuals that move astray from certain cultural values and certain cultural elements. So I propose here today that we should view cultures through a spectrum. Spectrums that are not only among cultures, but also within them. So you see, these assumptions of cultures based on which we create these various stereotypes from itself is inaccurate. And stereotypes deprive us of our identity. Us hybrids are often stereotyped by both communities. And well, guess what? They both often get it wrong. In Iran, I'm a westernized girl from Canada, and here, if I reveal that Iranian side of me, then automatically I'm labeled as an Iranian girl or a girl from Iran. Cultural stereotyping assumes that you should belong to one thing. And to be very honest with you, I don't know where I stand on that spectrum. If we were to create a spectrum of cultures, and let me stress that that spectrum would be a million dimensional, I wouldn't have a fixed spot on it. I would constantly find myself tilting to one side or another. I sometimes feel like blasting Cardi B, and sometimes feel like watching an Iranian movie. And you know what? Sometimes I crave ramen. And from time to time, I face an identity void and don't know how to express myself. I celebrate both Christmas and Nowruz, and both mean something to me. And yet, Nowruz isn't the same as it used to be when we lived in Iran. And no matter how hard we try, Christmas just won't mean the same to my family. Us hybrids have cultures of our own. We should embrace individuality and universalism and celebrate people's identities for who they are individually, as opposed to viewing them as a member of a larger collective. We should remove borderlines and ethnicities from defining one's identity. For the longest time, I moved between social groups, fitting in while not fully belonging. Now that I take a look at my closest friends, they're all one way or another hybrids or third culture kids. We are all so different from one another, and among us all, some of us are, well, more Canadian than the other ones, and we all stand on different parts of that spectrum. But what we all have in common is that duality of cultures and the understanding that you can be both, and that's okay. I want to introduce an idea here today that questions the culture of Canada as mosaic and describe it as more of a spectrum with a mix of colors and endless possibilities and cultural configurations. Oftentimes, we define multiculturalism by the coexistence of multiple cultures alongside one another with a clear distinction and yet mutual acceptance and respect of the different cultures. Basically, we're saying that they're mutually exclusive. The original American model of multiculturalism was the melting pot, as many of you might have heard, which is the notion that every incoming culture must melt and assimilate to form one uniform American monoculture. Well, the newer Canadian model evolved to celebrate diversity and adopted this mosaic culture in which every language and ethnicity has its own piece of mosaic. One's Iranian, one's Ukrainian, one's Chinese, and once you piece all of these together, you create this huge culture of Canada. But which piece of mosaic would I belong to? Are there any pieces for hybrids? I don't know. So multiculturalism in the modern world must transcend this idea of acceptance, and it must be accompanied by the removal of lenses through which we categorize people in different cultures. When I'm stereotyped, I'm not just misunderstood. It doesn't just end there. I'm alienated from the place that I feel that I belong to. I feel most at home here in Vancouver, but when I'm categorized as an Iranian, and especially when that's done in a judgmental sense, I'm not just categorized. I'm considered an outsider to where I feel most at home. In fact, as rooted as I am in my heritage culture, the culture of Iran of today has drastically evolved. And what I feel that belonging to sometimes doesn't even exist there anymore. When I go back, I search for the same things. I want to go back to the same restaurants, I want to eat the same foods, and I don't want to see my grandma aging. But the Iran of today is very different from the Iran I left 11 years ago. So you see, when I'm affiliated with it, sometimes it's even hard for me to understand what exactly it is that I'm affiliated with. I feel most at home here in Vancouver, and I want that loud and clear, because if I'm not accepted and understood here, then I'm left homeless. Our identity and culture are no longer defined by geographical space, by a religion or an upbringing, but we have a choice in who we are and how we wish to express ourselves, free of all of those boundaries.